Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Change on the Run podcast, where we discuss common change challenges and ways to address them when you're short of time. And I'm your host, Phil Buckley. Today's topic is addressing an emergency. Since there are many parts in motion during change, it makes sense that sometimes some of them just don't work. Plans are made with the best available information, and many assumptions are created to fill in the unknowns, especially when short of time. In this environment, emergencies are inevitable. There are also risks that can determine the success or failure of your change initiative. So, how do you address emergencies to minimize damage and quicken recovery? And my guest today is David Donaldson. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Phil, great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
David, thanks so much for taking the time. And I know we spent a couple of Saturdays together with Toronto Change Days. Your energy booster session was excellent. David has over 35 years of learning and development and business management experience. He is the customer success manager of HowSpace, a digital collaboration platform. David is a faculty member of the Schulich Executive Education Center and holds a master's certificate in adult training and education and teaching from the Schulich School of Business. David is a pilot and flight instructor and currently National Safety Officer. David, what's been your experience with addressing emergencies?
So thank you, Phil. And, we've got, about 4 weeks for this podcast, I think, because addressing emergencies, that's a huge topic.
There's no limit.
Oh, absolutely. And in the spirit of change on the run, we're going to give you some couple quick key nuggets. Addressing emergencies is a really fascinating topic. And from my experience, and there's a couple of angles that I'd like to take a look at today, and the first of which is around amygdala hijack, which is a bit of the kind of the brain science behind this. Because we've all had situations, we've all had emergencies in our life, and it's how we react to those emergencies that really dictates whether it's going to work out well or poorly, because we can often step into an emergency and actually make things much worse. So how we respond really becomes key. And in my experience, if we can get our emotional side in check, if we can get that fight or flight response in check and really kind of take that pause and take that exhale before we actually step in to address it, we're going to become much more effective in really dealing with that. So to give you 3 quick simple steps here, which I know you're a big fan of. Let's take those simple key steps. I boiled it down to these 3: stabilize, investigate, respond. Now you'll notice that respond is the third of the 3. Now the first one is stabilize. Let's say we're in the middle of a situation. The wheels are coming off the apple cart. Things are unraveling. We need to stabilize the situation so it does not get worse. And I cannot take credit for this because I talked to a good friend of mine, Dan. Now, Dan is a cardiac surgeon, and he spent a bunch of time in the ER. He's also a pilot. He's a student pilot of mine, in fact. I asked him one day around, how do you deal with emergencies? You're working in life-death situations here, like many of us, especially in this change context. When things come off the rails, it's not life or death. But he's dealing in literally, my next decision could potentially save or end a life. And his answer was put a finger in it. Now, he's a cardiac surgeon. So imagine you're standing there, you've got a patient on the table, their chest is open, and they start bleeding to death. Until you stop that bleeding, your patient is dying. So they literally take their finger, they put it in the hole, they stop the bleeding, and then they look around the table at the team and say, okay, now what do we do?
Wow.
This is about stabilizing. This is about how do I stop the situation from getting worse? So let's pause. Let's actually just say, you know what, we do need an immediate reaction here. We need to stop the bleeding, whatever that is in your world. Let's pause that. Now I've got time to think about what we can do. Let's investigate. What are the options? What can we do? What are the things we could do, we couldn't do? What is realistic in this situation? So investigate, and then let's respond. I'm going to take a second lesson from my flying world, which is SOAR: situation, options, actions, repeat. What's my situation? We've stabilized it. What are my options? I can do A, I can do B, I can do C. Take action, because as you say in your book, inaction is worse than bad action. And then very key here is repeat. This is a continuing, ongoing thing, because the second that we take any action, the situation is now different. So based on that new difference, what do I do next?
That's fascinating. And it makes sense and it's logical in the 3 different steps. You also mentioned the emotional response of the amygdala hijack. Mm-hmm. And when that happens, we aren't at our best. How do you trigger yourself not to trigger the emotions and to move into a logical process that you just mentioned?
So the first thing is we need to acknowledge that you cannot stop the emotions. The emotions are the emotions. And this is really what's at the heart of emotional intelligence. We are going to have that emotions. We are going to have that emotional response. The question now becomes, how do we act upon those? Recognition is a big part of that. So again, back to the SOAR model, what's my situation? Do you recognize that you're starting to get into some amygdala hijack? And then how do you interrupt? So we need to do a bit of pattern interruption here. You actually espouse that in your book. It's baked right in. And if I look at, your chapter on how to deal with an emergency, you gave a really good piece of advice here. Pro tip: address the person by their name. Raj, what do we need to do? Now, what you're doing here is actually accessing some of the executive function. Let's unpack this a little bit, and then let's figure out what's going on here. That's actually what makes that little simple piece of advice so powerful. As humans, we effectively have three brains. We have our brain stem, which is our autonomic functions: breathing, heartbeat, blinking. This just keeps us alive, right? And that's our brain stem. We have our midbrain, which is our limbic system. And our limbic system is our emotional brain. This is our open loop system. This is what connects us to everyone. So this is what, when you feel that sense of someone's in a very bad mood and suddenly the mood in the room changes, that's your limbic system at work. And it's actually a survival instinct that's designed to alert the rest of the tribe to danger. So if I sense a danger, I need to communicate that immediately to Phil and everyone else in the room to save everyone, right? And so we have this limbic system that actually creates us. And as we listen to this podcast, our brainwaves are starting to align, and that's our limbic system at work. So when you listen to stories, and this is part of the reason why storytelling is so effective, is that you actually start to sync up with the storyteller. And they've done fMRI studies to show that brainwaves will actually sync up and align when you have people listening to a story. So that's our midbrain, that's our limbic system, our emotional response. And this is where our amygdala is located, and where our fight-flight response is, because we're constantly evaluating, is this a threat? Do I need to fight or flight? And when that kicks in, it's a very instant responsive one. It's not a thoughtful one. It's not a, what should I do about this? This is a, I'm reacting. Now, our neocortex, which is our outer layer of our brain, and that's what you see when you see that nice picture of a ridgy, lumpy gray matter. That's our executive function, and all of that is language and math and future-based thought. So our ability to think in terms of cause and effect, to think in terms of, if I do this, here's the response I'm going to get, and to plan out in the future and to think in terms of, okay, if I do step A, step B, step C, step D, what's that going to turn into in 3 weeks? That's all executive function piece. Now, here's where your piece of advice is so brilliant. First thing is you're addressing the person by name, which is actually accessing the language centers of the brain, which is in the neocortex. Then you're asking them, what should we do? You're asking them to think in terms of future-based thought. So you're asking them to actually really process and think, what's going to be the cause and effect here? Now, this tricks the amygdala. Oh, you're requesting executive function. You're requesting higher-based thought. That means the emergency must be over. If this is truly an emergency, I'm shutting down the executive function, right? And this is where, if you look at something as simple as road rage. So let's take a look at a classic scenario of road rage. I'm running late. I'm driving through traffic. I'm getting frustrated. I'm getting stressed. I'm starting to panic because I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose the client, whatever that is. And so I start to kick into a bit of amygdala hijack. And then I do something that is going to absolutely guarantee that I'm late. I purposefully cause an accident because you pissed me off. You cut me off, and I'm going to get you back, all darn it. And that is purely a emotional response, not a logical one. So we do these things because we've lost the ability for future-based thought. Now, if I have my wits about me in my future-based thought, in my executive function, I'm going to think, if I rear-end Phil right now, I am not going to make my meeting. I'm going to lose my client. In fact, I'm probably going to end up in jail. It's going to cost me a bunch of time and money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Yeah, very late, absolutely. So when we get into that amygdala hijack, now to help kick people out of that is we ask for recall, ask for them to think and process. And you can actually do this with little kids. So we shared this with some clients, and they actually tried it with their kids, and it worked brilliantly. So you've got your toddler, and you're trying to put their coat on, you're trying to get them off to school, and they're just having the meltdown, right? So you ask them to do some recall. What's your favorite type of ice cream? Rocky Road. Great. Can you put your coat on? Okay. Because what's happened is it does a pattern interrupt. So we're getting into this spiral of, oh no, things are going wrong, and we're this and this and this. And we focus in on the negative and the what's broken. And it's like, Phil, okay, so first of all, I'm addressing you by name. So it's going to help pattern interrupt that, right? Phil, what do we need to do next? Like, what are we going to do to step out of this? It's such a subtle thing. I'm asking you to access your executive function and to think in terms of future-based thought.
And it's so interesting about the road rage example. And when we're driving, we might have a different response to what we're interpreting as an emergency as the people that are driving around us. I'm wondering, in the work that you're doing, you go into different organizations and they have different cultures that potentially define emergencies differently. Because some I've been in, as you're saying, so level-headed, let's take a look at it, quite a good process for managing through. And then others that are almost rewarding people for fighting fires. Like, we got to get in this. And, it's, we've got to crash each other. How do you redefine what an emergency is? Or should you, within a culture where it's almost run on emotion versus the rationale that you'd have with your third brain?
You're really starting to get into that whole culture side of thing. A simple tool for this that I have found super effective in my work is what's urgent and what's important. We tend to conflate these two. Something that is important is where I need to put my time and energy. If it's not important, get rid of it. When I talk about this model and work with people on this, and this was the huge aha for me, is that the important side of things is absolutely needs to be binary. Because people say, oh, well, there's degrees of important. No, it's important to that. No, you need to decide. Right? This is a simple decision. Either it is important, you're going to put time and energy to it, or it's not, and you need to ditch it. Now it becomes a question of what's urgent. And if there's something that's urgent and you have to deal with it now we're into firefighting mode, yeah? But we tend to deal with urgent things that are not important because we're distracted by the urgency of the situation. If it's really not important, why are you dealing with it? A simple example of this is the marketing phone call you get in the middle of dinner. We've got the family over, we're having Christmas dinner, we're celebrating a birthday, whatever. The phone rings, the family's around the table. So this isn't a phone call of someone's in urgency that needs help. This is a marketing call, and it most likely is. Okay, what's really important here? Well, my important is me and you having dinner. Let's focus on that. Let the machine take it. Because something's occurring right now, do I have to deal with this right away? Now, if it's something like a client call, you and I are in a meeting together and you are the most important thing in my world right now. My phone rings and I glance at the call display and I see it's an important client of mine. You know what? I may say, Phil, I need to pause for a second because this is really important and our conversation is absolutely important, but this is ringing right now and I just got to check. But it's how you check that becomes really the issue. And I had an old boss who was brilliant at this. So we'd be sitting in that exact scenario. We'd be in a meeting, the phone would ring. The first thing he would do was apologize. He would check the call display. And then he would hit do not disturb because he would look at the call display and think, okay, Dave, who's sitting in front of me in the middle of a meeting is more important to me than who's calling right now. But there was one person who he would pick the phone up for. You know who that was?
His loved one. I would hope that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it was. And he had 2 young kids at home. There's something more important than our business interaction, which is the family. But he would always answer the phone the same way. You pick it up and he says, hi, I'm in a meeting. Can I call you back? So what he's done is he's already evaluated the importance column. And he would also let me know, by the way, if there was an important call that he had to take. And what he just did there is he just evaluated the urgency. And he basically said to his spouse, is this urgent or can I call you back? I've never had one that was urgent. So to your point of culture, when you get people who get into this culture of firefighting, they're getting an adrenaline shot off of the urgency piece. But of course, part of that adrenaline shot is coupled with norepinephrine. It's coupled with cortisol because this is all part of the threat response that we get. And what they're doing is they're actually shutting down their executive function. They're literally becoming dumber as they function in that environment.
How do you teach someone to go to the mechanism versus going to their historic approach of emotions first?
It's a tough one. It absolutely is. And culture plays a big part of that. We have to live this. We have to respond this. Even when someone comes to us in that frenzied state, oh my God, the server's down, what are we going to do? Right? And they're in that sort of panicky state. It's like, okay, let's pause for a second. Let's think about what this is. And this is where our self-importance starts to come in, right? This is where our perceived importance starts to come in. I was working with one of the banks in the audit division, and I was there during 9/11. So post 9/11, we started to get into a lot of the business resumption planning. One of the first steps of business resumption planning is to evaluate how quickly you need to resume business. So are we a 24/7 operation or are we a Monday to Friday 9 to 5? And if the business is down for a couple days, what's the impact, etc. So to do this, they came up with a rating system and you would rate the importance of your business to the whole organization. And the audit division gave themselves the highest rating, which means you need to be up and running within 20 minutes of, something going down, etc. And I challenged that. I really did. Because it's like, guys, totally agree that audit in a banking context is super, super important. But if it's down for a week or two, that is not going to make a hell of beans of difference. It's not like the ATM network where if that's down for 20 minutes, we've got negative impact, right? It's something that you put in redundant servers, you put in backup systems, you put in mechanisms that are going to fail over automatically. Like, you can't have this go down.
What are the rules in addressing an emergency?
This is where we start to run into a bit of another dichotomy, because in general, we make better decisions as a group than we do as individuals. But when you get into an emergency situation, we don't have time to form a committee and evaluate all the options. You need to have a leader step forward. And this is where we want to think about what's going to be most effective in that scenario and situation. Too many cooks definitely spoil the stew, and we need to have some direction. And if it's a true emergency, there's an urgency there that doesn't really allow us the privilege and the benefit of taking the time. We definitely need to stabilize. We're going to do some investigation, but we're also going to do it in a very effective way, but we need to respond relatively quickly. When I talk to my professional pilot friends, and there's one in particular, he just retired from flying 777s. He was flying all over the world and just, a huge depth of experience. And anytime there was an incident or a situation in the news, I would ask him, what would you do? And his answer was always the same. I would pull out the ... checklist. So you've just had an engine quit on you. What would you do? I pull out the engine flame out checklist, or I put out the cannot lower undercarriage checklist, right? What they're doing is they have pre-planned how to deal with these emergencies, and they've thought about them. A risk is different than an emergency. A risk is an event that may or may not occur sometime in the future. An emergency is something that has occurred. How do we deal with the emergencies? We prepare ahead of time. We think about the risks. We manage our risks. We come up with plans ahead of time. And ironically, that pre-planning enables us to improvise. Because one misconception here around risk management is that I need to think about every potential scenario, come up with a scenario, and hey, this scenario didn't happen, so I've got nothing. Well, you actually do. You have a lot of very similar scenarios that you can draw on and draw from. And let's take elements from each of those other responses and tap them together on the fly to make this work. So there's a bit of a mindset here. We're prepared. And the fact that you're prepared enables you to kind of exhale and say, okay, I've thought about this. We've got a scenario here that's developing. I know some ways I can do this. I'm not surprised, because it's the surprise that kicks into the amygdala hijack, right? And it's the how am I going to respond to that? The second element to that is the situational awareness of seeing the things develop. Because emergencies, especially in today's world, are never a single item. They're always a sequence of events that build up and build up and build up. So we now get into, can I spot those sequence of events happening and start to intercept, or as we say, break the chain before it actually develops into a full-blown emergency?
Have you ever had an experience where you're quite prepared, but the person who is the point person for the emergency, she or he is struggling? What's your philosophy on jumping in or not jumping in? Or can you rectify the current situation and get it back on path?
That's a tough one. I did recently have this occur. We were helping run a conference, and a person showed up and things started going sideways on them. And you could just see that the confusion was starting to kick in. They kind of weren't thinking clearly. It becomes a question now of, if I step in and intervene, is that going to help or hinder the situation? So in this particular situation, I did actually step in for a moment, but I recognized very quickly that I was causing some confusion. So what I did is I very quickly disengaged and said, you know what, you need a little bit of space to be able to think that through. And ironically, there was a number of very skilled facilitators on the session, and a couple others did try to also step in, and we actually did get to that state of it functioning. But I also, while doing all of this, I'm looking at the urgency and the importance. And yes, the urgency is there, and yes, it's important. But you know what? It's actually not that super critical. This was not we're about to lose someone here. This is not about we're about to cause millions of dollars of damage or any of that sort of thing. I'm going to go back a bunch of years. We've just flown in an expert from BC. We've got now a bunch of representatives from multiple different organizations across Ontario. We've all gotten together for 2 days to roll out this new program. So we start, there's the projector in the middle of the room, and he's a good presenter. He's well prepared. He's come with printouts of his slides. We turn on the projector, and this was late October, by the way, and I'd left it sitting in the trunk of the car, and we turned it on, and there's a loud pop as the bulb explodes. So we now have no projector. Now, here's the scenario. We've just flown in an expert from across the country. We've traveled from across the province to all get together. We've got printouts of the slides. Where do you think the focus was? How do we fix the projector? And there's 3 guys up there and they're like looking at the projector. One of them picks it up and shakes it. They're poking it. They're turning it on and off. And I said, guys, we're here to talk. We're here to exchange information and ideas. We've got printouts of the slides. We don't need the projector. Let's shift our focus away from the issue and let's get back to the objective. And the objective was for us to go through this material. So we sat there, we flipped pages. We looked at the stuff, we had the conversation. Honestly, there was no difference if we'd never had the projector and we'd gone through this versus if we had the projector.
How do you kick out of that? I've got a one way of doing it and I'm not going to be flexible or agile to my detriment. Can you help people just abandon something that's not working for something that will be an improvement?
What's at play here, Phil, is completion bias. I'm heading down the path. I have a bias to get it completed, even though it's a bad path to go down. There's a brilliant study done by Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel laureate. And if you want to dig into this a bit deeper, pick up a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Fantastic book. They did a study where they gave people a scenario of 2 different stocks. So you bought some stock, you've had some return on your investment. One stock overperforms, one stock underperforms. You've now come to a point where you're going to sell one of those 2. Overwhelmingly, people chose the stock that was performing well to sell and kept the underperforming stock, even though the forecast where this is going to continue to underperform. And the rationale here is, but I've lost money, I need to get money back. You know the old expression, good money after bad? I bought a car and it had some problems and I had to fix it, and then it's got more problems and the trend is continuing. But yet I've put money into the car. I don't want to lose that money. Guess what? The money's already lost. You're not getting it back. You're just going to spend more. Ditch it. It's a lemon. It's time to move on, right? And we get into this because we've got our plan. We're heading down that path. Things are coming off the rails, but yet we've got this compulsion to complete our plan because it's our plan and we invested in it. We could have wasted a half a day arriving somewhere, getting a replacement bulb, getting a replacement projector, coming back. Or we can say, let's abandon that plan because it's not working. Let's change plans and let's go and do something else that's going to work and get us to our objective. That can be a bit of a hard pill to swallow. But again, back to the emotional intelligence piece, it's about recognizing the emotion in it, which is, but I invested, I created the plan, I created my slide deck, right? Let me walk through it, even though it's completely wrong. We need to really shift our focus and be focused on what our team needs. And this is a really good spot to bring in the other piece that I wanted to just touch on is resilience. Resilience is the ability to stay productive in times of disruption. And disruption is when things don't go to plan, basically. So let's shift our focus away from completing the plan as it originally was stated to how do we stay productive as the wheels come off the cart.
We talked a lot about individuals. I'm wondering if we could take a look at the team lens. And over the last 20 months, almost everybody has been in some form of hybrid relationship, and Zoom, as you'd mentioned, and Teams and working that way. Given we have platforms such as Housepace, which are really dynamic and enable people to communicate well, how does a collaboration platform like Housepace enable response with a large group of people?
Housepace is an interesting platform because unlike Zoom or MS Teams, which is a synchronous environment. So with Zoom, for example, as we're doing right now, you and I are together within the same 1 hour window, and that's when it is happening. Housepace is really targeted for extending that beyond us getting together. So this is the ability for us to continue the conversation, even though we're both not in the same room. So as soon as I'm done here, I'm going to go sign on to my next call. You're probably going to go have lunch because, you're much more balanced than me. But we can continue the conversation at our leisure at a time which kind of makes sense. So when the urgency is relatively low, we can have that sort of more asynchronous conversation. But when the urgency gets higher, having a synchronous conversation starts to make more sense. So now it becomes, can I, much like my old boss, can I say, hey, Phil, can we talk about this at another time? Because right now is not good for me. If the answer is yes, then we can start to employ platforms like Housepace to be able to enable those conversations. And layer that with a bit of time zone thing, because of course, as I'm thinking about this, the majority of my team is in Finland, Central European time. They've already finished their day. So we have a small window of overlap. Let's take that back to what we talked about earlier, the whole preparedness piece, the whole planning ahead piece, the whole how do we think about this so that we're not running around like chickens with our heads cut off and being very reactionary in our response. Let's be a little bit more deliberate.
Dave, thanks so much. There's so many tips and insights about how to address an emergency. And in the spirit of change on the run, if you only had time to do one action to address an emergency, one that would give you 80% of the value in 20% of the time, what would that be?
Wind your watch. I know that seems super weird and random. This is a piece of advice I got from a flight instructor. And the most time dependent, urgent situation that we train for is called a rope break. So you're 300 feet above the ground, you're in a glider that has no engine. The rope that's pulling you from the tow plane has just broken, and you have just enough altitude to turn around and land in the other direction, back on the runway. And it's very safe. I've done it 100 times. But people get panicky about it. They go, oh my God, we got to do this all now. Right? And it's like, no. Wind your watch. Pause for a moment. Wind your watch. Think about that. Okay, let's do this action. Okay, pause. Wind your watch. How did that work out? Is it working well? And when I went on to do my power plane training, I remember distinctly that exact scenario. We'd just taken off. We're at about 200 feet above the ground, climbing away from the runway. The instructor reaches over, pulls the engine back to idle, says, you've just had an engine failure. It's like, okay. Well, the field over there looks good. Let me make that turn. And I start to make that turn. And as I'm making the turn, I'm going, yeah, that's not going to work out well. And I don't want to cartwheel into this field right below us. So there's enough room for me to land ahead. It's in corn, which isn't ideal, but it'll be a safer landing that we'll walk away from. So I'm going to level my wings and I'm going to bring it in safely there. And then, of course, he let it come down. And we're about 20 feet above the ground and he throttles up and we fly away and debrief that. And he said it was a good dealing of the emergency, because the first thing I did was I didn't panic. I looked at my options. I made a choice. I updated that as the situation progressed, changed the option to a new option, not necessarily the best option, but the best option based on how the situation was playing out. So it became my new best option. So instead of staying locked into the first option that was now no longer working out, we updated it. So wind your watch. There's very few things in life, I have to respond within a few seconds.
What a great recommendation. And it's probably the best recommendation you could give, but I'm going to ask you for one more. Just as we close off the show, is there just a watch out or something you want to underscore from our conversation today that you could leave with our listeners?
I'm going to tie this back to our emotional intelligence piece. Look for your own early warning signs. What are the things that are saying to you, you know what, I'm starting to get into amygdala hijack? I've asked this of hundreds of people over the years. Some people say, I feel hot, or I can feel the blood pressure rising, or the back of my neck, whatever that looks like. And then when you start to feel that, intervene early, because what's happening is if you are getting into a bit of an amygdala hijack, your brain is starting to release those chemicals. And if you can get in front of that, it helps bring things down faster and quicker. And one of the easiest ways is take a big deep breath. Because when we get into amygdala hijack, we're into fight or flight. Adrenaline is released. We tense our muscles to get ready for the fight or the run, and we breathe shallow. So the second you take a big deep breath, and I'm going to invite you to do that right now, you just signaled your brain that there is no emergency. And you'll notice that when you do that, you actually feel a little clearer. You actually feel a little bit more like, okay, I can think through this.
That is great. Thank you. Thank you for that gift. And how can people get in contact with you?
Absolutely. I'd love to continue the conversation, Phil. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm there. You can also get me on email if that's your preference, david.donaldson@housebase.com. And if you're interested in digging in a little bit deeper into the resilience conversation, I actually did a TEDx. It's called The Upside of Down. Just search David Donaldson TEDx and you'll find it. And again, more than happy to continue the conversation. And Phil, I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much. And I'll put a link to your TEDx talk into the show notes as well. Thanks again for a great conversation today. Thank you for listening to our podcast. And if you're interested in hearing more podcasts like this, please hit subscribe or share this with someone that you think would find benefit in it. And until the next time, I wish you all the best as you continue to lead change.